Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. This was going to be the second part of a two-part series, but it's turned into three parts. It started to run long, and I'm also a little bit under the weather today, for the first time in a really long time, actually, so I'm not sure how this is going to sound, but it's probably better that I make this second part episode a little more than an hour long rather than almost 2 hours. So, this will be the second part of a three-part series on these two wild and crazy old ladies, Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt. If you haven't listened to part one, I would highly suggest that you go do that first. Listen to episode 257, then come back to this. Otherwise, it'll be weird and backwards. And if you do or did listen to that first one, then I don't have to go over all the social media stuff, leaving me good reviews, giving me money, generously donating to the production and creation and maintenance of this lovely yet murdery podcast. So we left off in part one with the deterioration of Helen and Olga's relationship as they both became consumed with their own greed following the death of their second quote-unquote hit-and-run victim, Kenneth McDavid, as they were left waiting for his policies to pay out. So let's pick up the story from there. So just like what happened with Paul's insurance policies, there was a months-long delay in Helen and Olga being able to collect on their claims on Kenneth's life. By the time 2006 rolled around, it was getting to be more than 6 months since Kenneth was murdered, and the ladies hadn't seen a penny from their various claims. There's various reports on how many claims there actually were. One report said 13, another one said 17. But whatever the case was, it was a ridiculous number of life insurance policies. What they did not know, what Helen and Olga did not know, was that their claims had been under investigation, and it had already been determined that they would not be seeing, at least from a couple of insurance companies, any pennies, no pennies whatsoever, from several of those policies that they had spent the previous 2 years dutifully paying the premiums on while they took care of Kenneth, who, effectively, like Paul, was a dead man walking all that time. The minute that Kenneth accepted Helen and Olga's generous offers of food and shelter, he was as good as dead. So yeah, from a couple of Helen and Olga's biggest policies, they weren't going to get anything. And throughout this, I've come to find that even insurance companies do have somewhat of a sense of humor, or at least a flair for dramatics. Because it was decided that on one of their policies, they would send a representative out to meet with Helen and Olga, telling them that they did have a check to give them. So the ladies, as you can imagine, were exploding with excitement, as much as 70-somethings are able to with their brittle bones and rickety joints. They were about to get shown the money finally. All their hard work and dedication was about to pay off in spades. Well, when they received that call that a representative was prepared to hand-deliver a check to them, Helen insisted that they meet at one of her favorite places. It was some deli located in Hollywood, to which the insurance company representative agreed. Olga said that she would meet the same representative later on in the day, but she wanted to meet them at her bank so she could just make her deposit right away. The person who would be meeting up with Helen first and then Olga was an insurance investigator named Ed Webster. And if I'm not mistaken, he was sent from Mutual of New York. He would be accompanied by a detective on the case that was investigating Helen and Olga named Rosemary Sanchez, and she had a hidden camera with her to capture the whole event. When Ed and Rosemary arrived at Helen's designated meeting place, she was already there, looking as well put together as ever. And I'm sure it was all Helen could do to keep herself from salivating over this money as she sat there waiting. And as soon as Ed and Rosemary made their way to Helen's usual corner table, she, as bitchy, pushy, and demandy as ever, immediately made it clear that she had absolutely no time to waste with these peasants. How long was this going to take? Don't ask her any questions. She would not be answering anything at all. All she wanted was the check and to leave immediately. After Helen produced her ID cards to verify that she was indeed crazy old lady number 1, she signed a couple of things and Ed presented her with an envelope. And there was indeed a check inside of it, but definitely not the check or the amount that Helen had been anticipating. Remember, she's expecting tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars from the 2 policies that she had purchased from this particular insurance carrier. In all, the 2 policies totaled $1 million, but no $1 million would be had. Not today, Satan. It was a check for a meager $1,800, the total amount that Helen had paid in premium costs, accompanied by a letter telling Helen to get the F out of here, your claims are denied. I bet Ed felt so disgustingly happy and satisfied on the inside, because I know I would, but he had to put on this super professional act on the outside. I don't think I could have kept a straight face and not danced out of that deli laughing my ass off at these 2 broke-ass old ladies. But the audio that was recorded was a little hard to hear. You can hear some of it in Keith Morrison's podcast. But you can hear Helen's tone, and she is not happy. You're not going to pay me the full amount? You're wasting my time. This is unacceptable. You've caused me all this grief. And then she threw the check and the envelope down on the table and stormed out. Oh man, I hope to never feel that level of disappointment that I'm sure she was feeling, thinking that she was going to waltz out of that deli with hundreds of thousands of dollars, only to leave with absolutely nothing in her hands. It kind of reminded me of Lori Vallow, and this would be the time when she had her brother kill her husband. And the next day, Lori was calling up his life insurance carrier to make a claim, only to find out that her husband, Charles Vallow, behind her back, changed the beneficiary of his $1 million policy to his sister. There isn't a whole lot of pleasure that I get out of the Lori Vallow / Chad Daybell case, but that is hands down one of my favorite moments in that whole sordid mess. So yeah, hissy fit Helen tantrumed her big poofy hairdo out the door. As the investigator and the detective watched as Helen stormed her way out, they saw her get on her cell phone. They assumed she called Olga to let her know that the claim had been denied, because when Ed and Rosemary showed up at their scheduled meeting with Olga at her bank, she never showed up. So they went over to her place of residence and they found her there, but she was just as verbally combative as Helen had been. At first, Olga didn't want to open up her front door when they knocked. Eventually, she cracked it open slightly, at which point Ed was able to slide the denial letter through the door, but Olga ended up flinging the envelope back out the door and proceeded to yell and curse and threaten to call the cops. Little did she know that a cop was right there with Ed. And again, it must have been super exhilarating. I mean, it sounds so fun, right? Knowing that you're dealing with a couple of devious, murderous scoundrels and getting to see them come completely unglued because it's so crazy, right? That they're pissed off because they wasted 2 years of their lives, tens of thousands of dollars, and killed somebody, all to get denied. The nerve of these two, right? To get mad because their scheme didn't work out. So while Ed's investigation of Helen and Olga and his confrontation with them would be one of the first times the ladies would run into a real big snafu, it would not be their last. When it came to the criminal investigation and the task force that was formed, I believe they nicknamed it the Granny Task Force. Their immediate concern was that even though what they were seeing, 2 elderly ladies, and what they were investigating, 2 brutal murders, wasn't exactly computing in the minds of these officers. They call it cognitive dissonance, where what you see doesn't match up with what you know. I believe that's the definition. I'm not sure. Anyway, these officers could not leave anything to chance while they worked on trying to unravel exactly what it was they had going on here. The fact is that they had 2 dead men who were specifically chosen and targeted because those responsible for their deaths did not think anyone would care, because Olga and Helen believed that their lives didn't matter. And the thing that investigators knew for a fact was that these suspects profited handsomely as a result of Paul's death, and now they were in the process of attempting to profit handsomely again as a result of Kenneth's death. The motive was clear, but could they really prove that these elderlies had the means? I mean, 2 old ladies? Cold-blooded murderers? Even seasoned members of law enforcement were incredulous. But not us, right? We know better by now. Anything is possible. So once the investigators had it reconciled that, yes, these were their prime murder suspects, and the reality was these ladies had to be considered extremely dangerous because who knew what they could be up to next? And we're going to soon find out that there was indeed another plan in the works. They had started in on somebody else. They were just in the beginning stages of it. It took a very long time in order for Helen and Olga to work their way up to the murder. 2 years, countless hours of their time, tens of thousands of dollars in their ill-gotten money. That's a lot of commitment. They had another person on deck ready to go. They just needed for the situation with Kenneth to get moving along so that they could receive his payouts, and they'd be able to fully invest in their next victim. We know that they blew through their money very quickly. They indulged themselves in it. And they might have been telling themselves that they would try to do things differently the second time around, that maybe they should be more careful with their spending, make this money stretch, maybe do some investing, prepare for retirement from their murdering careers. I don't know what these 2 thought that they were going to do once they collected on Kenneth's life, but I don't know if their fragile relationship could withstand another years-long investment into a third life insurance fraud scheme. But greedy bitches be greedy bitches, and they'd probably be willing to set aside the animosity in order to do this again and again. Because the fact of the matter is, in murder conspiracies this complicated and in-depth, they needed each other, whether Helen and Olga liked it or not. But anyway, once the task force was formed, they went ahead and placed Helen and Olga under 24/7 surveillance. In the meantime, the investigators looking into Kenneth's death managed to track down one of his sisters, who was still living in Northern California, and they went there in person to deliver the news that her brother was dead. She was very surprised and stunned to receive this news. It had been several months by the time they found her to inform her of what had happened. The sister explained that it had been quite some time since she had heard from Kenneth. He kind of just drifted away from the family, and she had not heard from him or been able to get in touch with him for several years. When they explained to her what was going on and the circumstances surrounding his death and the manner in which he had died, that there were these 2 old ladies that were beneficiaries on a lot of insurance policies, the sister was taken aback. She would say that she had no clue who Helen and Olga were. But, why would she? She hadn't been in touch with Kenneth for quite some time. When all was said and done, Helen and Olga had taken out as many as 8 policies on Paul, and they had at least 13 policies on Kenneth. And we will come to find out that both Helen and Olga had taken it upon themselves to purchase insurance policies unbeknownst to each other. As the investigation into these women went on, they were uncovering policy after policy after policy, one right after another. In some of the policies, both Helen and Olga were listed as beneficiaries. Some of them were just Helen. Some of them were just Olga. They listed themselves as fiancés. In others, they were listed as cousins. Kenneth was listed as a nephew, a business partner, etc., etc. So once they had lined these policies up side by side, only then did they have a true picture of the scope of what this fraud entailed. And as this investigation was picking up steam and the task force were getting to know just how elaborate and convoluted Helen and Olga's planning had been, That is when they found, in some subpoena, some bank records that belonged to Olga, where she had paid for some rubber stamps at a local company. When investigators went there, it took some time, but they found receipts for both Paul Vados and Kenneth McDavid's signatures to be manufactured into rubber stamps. But those weren't the only names that Olga had turned into stamp form. There were upwards of a dozen rubber stamps that she had made in various names. So it wasn't just the 2 times that she had gone in there for Paul and Kenneth. She'd been a serial rubber stamp purchaser. That's why the employees at the store started referring to Olga as the Black Widow. They figured she was up to something shady, and they weren't wrong. And what this information gave to investigators was basically a list of other men to try and track down and speak to about their relationship or how they got to know Helen and Olga. And while the scope of their criminal activity didn't involve all that many murders, and I mean, even one murder is one too many, but what they were finding is the ladies had been at their schemes and frauds for many years by the time law enforcement started sniffing around in their backgrounds. It made clear just how these ladies went from pickpocketers to serial lawsuit filers to insurance fraudsters to murderers. Discovered during the course of the investigation into Helen and Olga was the name of another man who in the year 2000 also died by being hit by a car, about 1 year after Paul Vados had met the same fate, and it was a gentleman named Fred Downey. It was discovered that Fred, a 96-year-old man from back east, Cape Cod to be exact, somehow ended up dead, struck down by a car, all the way over in Los Angeles, California. It did not take very long for investigators to connect the dots and found that Fred did have a connection to someone with the last name of Golay, but it wasn't Helen this time. It was the third of Helen's 3 children, the one I mentioned towards the beginning of part 1, Keisha Golay, who lived in New York. There is so little out there about Keisha Golay, but probably for good reason. Because if I were her, and I had a crazy-ass mom like Helen, I'd go into hiding too. Probably change my name. So anyway, Keisha lived and worked in New York, and from the very, very little that I was able to find, I get the impression that she was a model of some sort. She was, and maybe is still, quite beautiful. She had a sister, another one of Helen's daughters with a different father, and her name was Pamela Latimer, and that sister lived in Cape Cod. And it was Fred who had met and become friends with Pamela first, and through her, he met Keisha. Fred, of course, was way, way, way older than Keisha, more than 60 years, but I mean, this guy was older than dirt. But he seemed to be a bit enamored with the beautiful young woman who was paying him some attention, as she affectionately referred to Fred as her grandpa. He used to be the owner of a private kindergarten, and Fred never had children of his own. But anyway, at some point, Keisha talked Fred into moving to California and into her mother's rental property in Santa Monica. This is a guy who had lived in Massachusetts for nearly a century. The idea of moving to sunny Southern California sounded kind of like a dream come true. What better place in the world would you want to spend the last couple years of your life? At the beach, working on his tan, passing the time until it was his time to go. It was an offer that Fred could not refuse. So when Fred told some of his family about his plans, he said that there was this woman, Keisha's mother, named Helen, who was the proprietor of several homes and apartments in Southern California, and that she was basically going to help take care of him. So in the frigid month of a Massachusetts February in 2000, Fred made the move 3,000 miles to the other side of the country. He wrote letters to at least one family member back home, telling them that he was loving his new life and his new digs, so glad that those New England winters were behind him. It was the best decision that he had ever made. He had never seen so many people out and about walking around in the sun on the beaches so early in the year, while everybody back east was still bundled up for the freezing temperatures. I took a look at the average temperature in Cape Cod across a year, and never does the average ever get above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 26 Celsius. Like I said, those are just averages. I'm not saying that Massachusetts doesn't get heat waves. They do. They have a hot day now and then. But it is quite another thing to see people walking around in shorts and t-shirts in February and March. However, by the time summer started rolling around, Fred's letters started to sound as if he kind of missed Cape Cod. It didn't take long for the novelty of California's idyllic weather to wear thin, and it does get really hot as the summer months drag on. Not Nevada level kind of hot, but hot nonetheless. There will be days that are sweltering, but it didn't seem like that's what was wearing on Fred. At least that wasn't what he was saying in his letters home to his family. It started to sound like he was getting kind of lonely. Helen was always busy working, taking care of her properties, and attending to her poofy hairdo. Keisha was busy off doing her own thing. They weren't hanging out with Fred, and soon Fred's life had become very, very quiet. But at that point, Fred didn't have very much in the way of options. When he moved to California, he sold his home in Cape Cod to Helen and Keisha for a grand total of $1. He turned his life savings over to Keisha, and he made Keisha the beneficiary of all of his worldly assets should something happen to him. And then, in November of 2000, sometime around the Thanksgiving holiday, Fred's relatives back home in Massachusetts got word that Fred had been struck by a vehicle and had sustained some pretty serious injuries. He was 97 years old when he was hit by a car just outside the apartment that he lived in that was owned by Helen Golay. Fred was in the hospital for about a month before he finally succumbed to his injuries. The investigation found his death to be an accident. He was hit by a woman named Cheryl Clark. She was driving her Honda Civic when Fred apparently stepped out into the road, and then she struck him. Cheryl Clark was found to not be at fault, and the whole thing was ruled an accident. When Fred's niece was contacted by the funeral home, it was only then that she learned her uncle had died. And then that's when she started learning of this Helen Golay woman and how she and her daughter had complete control over all of Fred's assets. It was discovered through the course of the investigation that once Keisha and Helen got their hands on Fred's home, which he sold to them for $1, they took out a nearly $82,000 loan against it and then sold it for $200,000. The investigation also revealed that Helen and Keisha had somewhat of a contentious relationships amongst each other. Keisha, and you know, apples not falling far from the tree, right? She sued her mom once in a dispute over a property transfer where Keisha accused Helen of forging her signature on related documents. I also found out in 2003 that Helen filed a harassment lawsuit against Keisha as well. So, yeah, they're not exactly fans of each other. Anyway, Fred was buried back home at some burial plot that had long ago been purchased for him in some prepaid plan. Some years later, in 2008, our favorite storyteller, Keith Morrison, went to the gravesite with Fred's niece, and when he brushed away some of the dead leaves surrounding Fred's grave, he found there to be prepaid slots to Fred's left and to his right, one for Keisha and one for Helen, along with Fred's wife, who had preceded him in death by more than 25 years. It was the first Fred's niece had ever realized that those two were planning to spend eternity next to Fred. In the end, nothing ever really came of what happened with Fred and Keisha and Helen and whatever it was they had done. It really did seem to be a huge coincidence that Fred was struck by a vehicle nearly exactly 1 year after Paul, but nothing they did with Fred's property or his assets was illegal as far as anyone knew. And as of today, as far as anyone knows, Keisha Golay was never charged with anything and has managed to stay under the radar ever since. Later on in this episode, I'm going to tell you about an article that I found about Keisha, which is pretty funny and stupid at the same time. Anyway, getting back to the surveillance. The team following Olga started noticing that it appeared as though she was trying to work on ensnaring yet another old, down-on-his-luck man. And this would turn out to be a Hungarian gentleman named Joseph Gabor. She was introduced to him while she had already been under surveillance. So investigators were actually getting to see one of these ladies in action from the start. And they were looking on as Olga was meeting this guy on the street, in public places, and investigators were actually watching as Olga produced a packet of paperwork asking him to sign his name. Even though they're watching from a distance, it's pretty clear what Olga was up to. So the decision was made that they simply cannot risk having these two ladies running amok like this. There was a very real fear that these two were fixin' to kill somebody else. There was that, and the fact that during the course of the investigation, they discovered the nearly 24 insurance policies that Helen and Olga had on both Paul and Kenneth. They decided to make their move. They were able to secure warrants for the arrest of both Helen and Olga, and on May 18th, 2006, the both of them were taken into custody and charged with fraud. The thing was, the investigators had what they needed to levy a solid case against both women on the fraud charges, but they had yet to come up with enough evidence to charge them with murder. But they were working on it. In the meantime, it was good enough to get the two of them off the streets for the time being with some fraud convictions, just to ensure public safety from these two menaces to society. And when they were arrested, they had this on video, but I haven't been able to find it. But if you listen to the thing about Helen and Olga, you'll hear some of it, and you get a glimpse into what these two were like. But of the two, Helen was more of the defiant one. And I mean, Olga was too, but she was also a chatterbox. Because after their arrest, they were put into an interrogation room together, which is what investigators wanted. And they were hoping that one of them, and they figured it would be Olga, would start running her mouth, which she did. And I'll get more into that in a minute. But when they were arrested, Helen went into her whole usual thing. How dare you do this to me? Who do you think you are? Do you know who I am? You don't know what you're doing, blah, blah, blah. What an annoying woman to have to deal with, right? She literally was complaining the whole way there. At that point, the only charges that they were going to potentially have against them were the fraud charges. And it seemed like Helen knew that, or at the very least was confident that that was all investigators had. But it was enough to keep Helen and Olga off the streets and the public at large safe from these two crazy old ladies. So for the time being, Helen and Olga would be facing federal fraud charges, about 10 in all at this point. And when they were first taken into custody, it seemed like it was the first time Olga learned that Helen had taken out more policies on Kenneth's life than they had originally planned or talked about. And the truth was, Olga was doing the same thing. And in these recordings that I told you about a minute ago in the interrogation room, you can hear some of it on Keith's podcast. Olga started complaining about it as soon as they were left in the room with her Zsa Zsa Gabor style accent. This is your fault. You cannot make that many insurances. All of it is in your name only. 3 different ones. Why you take out these extra insurances? Too many you have. You cannot do that. But Helen didn't want to talk to Olga at all, at least at first. She said that if Olga didn't stop, that she would ask to be taken to a separate room, and she told Olga, I don't want to talk to you. Investigators knew that Olga had a much more talkative personality than Helen, so this was something that they had planned and orchestrated. It was the FBI that effected the arrest, but they were brought to that LAPD interrogation room, so those who were investigating the murders, which was in the LAPD's jurisdiction, they could get this conversation on audio and video. So Olga carried on, accusing Helen of getting way too greedy, getting too many insurance policies, them losing out on collecting on Kenneth's life and subsequently getting investigated and arrested was all Helen's fault, so says Olga. It wasn't difficult for the two of them to turn on each other as things had started falling apart because they'd already had a strained relationship to begin with. Investigators on the case realized that the two of them were working on getting over on each other behind one another's backs for quite some time by then, but it seemed to really ramp up during the time that they were getting ready to murder Kenneth McDavid. You see, there was a recorded conversation with one of the insurance policy carriers, and in it, Helen had made a phone call, and this happened a full year and a half before Kenneth died. So Helen was on the phone, and she said that Kenneth was on the phone too, and you can hear a voice that sounds a little bit deeper, and that voice is claiming to be Kenneth McDavid. And this is for him to be interviewed for the policy over the phone, which was a requirement. Helen called claiming to be Kenneth's secretary, and then she said she would get him on the phone. Then there was a pause, and then she got back on the line, and she deepened her voice and said that she was Kenneth, that Helen was his fiancée, that his occupation was an investor. And in the call, Helen's usual partner in crime, Olga, was nowhere to be found in terms of being involved in this policy. That's because Helen decided to take out policies without Olga, so she would be able to collect 100% of the payout and not have to share. Like I said, Olga would be doing the same thing. The investigation would also reveal that Helen had done the same thing with Paul. She had taken out several policies behind Olga's back. In the end, Helen had 3 additional policies on both Paul and Kenneth's lives. 2 weeks before Kenneth would be killed in that alleyway, struck down by a car, or so it was meant to appear, Helen had called up one of the insurance companies and attempted to have Olga removed as a co-beneficiary, but the company refused. And the thing was, Helen was worried that Olga might be very capable and willing to try and do the same thing to her, so Helen tried to get ahead of it and be the first one to strike. Helen had this growing mistrust of Olga because Olga had previously attempted to contact at least one of the insurance companies in an effort to report that Helen was filing a fraudulent claim. Olga had begun to realize that Helen was double-crossing her behind her back, and it made her really angry, so out of spite, she tried making that fraud report on Helen. Olga also tried to purchase policies on her own without Helen's knowledge as well. It's really amazing that these two greedy old ladies carried on for as long as they did. When you really think about it, they were in this for like more than 2 decades. So it's no wonder things boiled over between them when they were arrested and thrown into that interrogation room together. And while the ladies sat there squabbling about insurance policies, they never brought up the murders, which is what investigators were hoping for. So the investigators came into the interrogation room a couple of times to provide the ladies with reminders that they were under arrest and they had the right to remain silent, so that it would be clear that if they were going to talk, they understood, or should have understood, that anything that they were going to say to each other in that room could be used against them. But in order to prompt them to start talking about the men and their lives that they purchased all of those policies on, investigators would enter back into the room and start throwing around the M word, murder. One of the detectives just casually mentioned that there was an active murder investigation going on in tandem with the fraud investigation. But it was like in one ear and out the other because these women were so centered on trying to work together to fight these fraud charges and how to get their hands on the rest of the money that they felt like they were owed from these insurance companies, that it really goes to show that these two were never even concerned in the least bit about Paul's life or Kenneth's life. These women treated them like they were disposable, that they didn't matter, that they had gotten away with it because of that. And neither one of them even batted an eyelash at the mention of murder. It wasn't even on their radar, because to them, Paul and Kenneth were irrelevant. While the fraud charges would subject Helen and Olga to some legal entanglements for a while, it wouldn't be forever. It would be only a matter of time before they were out and about and most likely back at it again, because what else are these two old ladies going to do with themselves? They had no legitimate income to speak of. At least Olga didn't. Maybe Helen did, but you could see that Helen there's no amount of money that's ever going to be enough for that lady. So I think it's safe to say that after these ladies go to jail, and if they were to be convicted and serve time for fraud, they'd only come out the other end of that so much worse for the wear. They knew what these ladies were capable of, and that they were inherently a danger to older, vulnerable men. And it would only be a matter of time before someone else would wind up dead. And we know darn well that Helen and Olga have absolutely no regard for anybody but themselves. So the murder investigation would carry on, as Helen and Olga were going to go down for these fraud charges. What they really needed was to try and nail down some of the actual evidence beyond the circumstantial stuff that they already had linking the two of them to the murders of both Paul and Kenneth. I've already talked about how investigators found that in Kenneth's case there was a surveillance video of the vehicle they believed to be the one that deposited him into the alleyway and then proceeded to back over him and then run over him again for good measure, dragging, crushing, and killing this poor man. And they were able to identify that vehicle as either a Ford Taurus or a Mercury Sable station wagon. Well, during the course of this lengthy investigation, and through a search of Helen's things specifically, they were able to find that she did purchase a Mercury Sable station wagon from some dealership using the ID of a woman who had a while back had her purse stolen from the gym where she was a member. And what do you know, Miss Keisha Golay was also a member of that gym. I mean, it's like all of these dots are connecting, and they would eventually link the car to Helen, even though it was never in her name, and I'll talk more about that specifically also a little bit later on. But the information about that car, its VIN number, and its license plate number was in Helen's possession. So now, dreamers, at this point, I'm going to start referring to the court documents on this case. They have a lot of details, tons of details, and it's all in good chronological order, so I'm going to share that information with you related to their investigation into Helen and Olga. One of the first things that gets explained is the nature of these policies, these insurance policies. I'm not all that savvy when it comes to life insurance, and there may be some of you out there who aren't either. So just briefly, the kinds of insurance Helen and Olga were purchasing on the lives of Paul and Kenneth were term life insurance policies, which are the cheapest. It's effective for a specified term of years and has no investment component, but they do require the existence of an insurable interest. In other words, a relationship between the insured and the beneficiary based on a familial relationship or a blood relationship, or through marriage, or a financial relationship such as a business partner. And the purpose of requiring an insurable interest is to prevent a named beneficiary from having the incentive to cause the death of the insured person. Under California law, term life insurance policies become incontestable after being in force for 2 years after the issuance date, assuming all premium payments have been made. Before a policy becomes incontestable, the insurance company can cancel or rescind the policy upon discovery that it was obtained through fraud or misrepresentation. After a 2-year period, however, the policy will remain in force even if it had been procured through deceptive means. A claim that postdates the incontestability period must be paid unless the insurance carrier can demonstrate that the policy was procured by criminal means. Insurers will typically ask whether the person seeking the insurance policy has other policies on the same insured person in order to make sure that the particular insured person is not overinsured. That is, if a person has a financial net worth of $1 million, the insurer will not want to provide insurance out of proportion with that amount. The first of Helen and Olga's victims, Paul Vados, immigrated to the United States from Hungary in 1956. After his wife died in 1985, Paul moved to his daughter Stella's house in Hollywood. But Stella lost contact with Paul in 1995 when he moved to Northern California. Neither Helen nor Olga had any familial relationship with Paul. From 1998 until his death on November 8, 1999, Paul lived in an apartment on South Fedora Street in Los Angeles. According to the off-site apartment manager, Paul appeared to have no job and would typically leave the building in the morning and return in the afternoon completely drunk. Paul kept his apartment filthy, and at some point during his time living there, Olga told the manager that she was, quote, in charge of Paul Vados. After he died, Olga came to the apartment to retrieve Paul's belongings. Norma Ceja was 12 years old when she lived at the apartment building on South Fedora Street. Norma lived with her mom, who was the building's on-site manager, and whenever necessary, Norma would help translate English for her mom. They knew Paul, and they knew of him to be living alone in one of the apartments. There were times when Norma and her mom would bring food to Paul whenever they found him to be too drunk to take care of himself. Sometimes Norma would even help him make his way to his apartment when she would see him around the building, too inebriated to make it to his own front door by himself. Olga usually visited Paul twice a month. She claimed to be his sister and would bring him groceries. But Norma and her mom would check on Paul on a daily basis. Shortly after they learned of Paul's death, Olga came by and told Norma and her mom that Paul had been run over either by a bus or a train and to just go ahead and dump his belongings into the dumpster bin. During that time that Paul lived there, it was Norma's mom's responsibility to collect the rent from the building's tenants. Paul paid his rent with money orders. Sometimes he brought it to them by himself, other times he was accompanied by Olga. When Norma's mother noticed that she had not seen Paul for about 3 days, she asked Norma to call Olga to let her know that they were concerned since they normally saw him every day. There were times when Norma and her mother saw Olga in the company of another elderly white woman. It was at 7 a.m. on the morning of Monday, November 8, 1999, that LAPD police officer Lee Willman was called to investigate what he assumed had been a fatal traffic accident in an alleyway near 307 North La Brea Avenue in Los Angeles. This accident scene was located only 1 mile away from Olga Rutterschmidt's residence. When Officer Willman arrived, it was raining heavily. Paul's body was lying crosswise in the middle of the alley. He had no wallet or identification on him. It appeared that he had been lying on the ground when he was struck by a car. His chest and torso were twisted and crushed. There were abrasions on his nose and grease on his chin. Paul's clothing was covered with grease in the areas where he suffered injuries. His left hand had abrasions and grease stains consistent with contact with the car's hot oil pan, muffler, or tailpipe. His injuries and the placement of his body was indicative of being run over by a car that was traveling relatively slow. There were no glass fragments or any car parts broken off at the scene. Now, Paul was eventually identified after his body was autopsied and his fingerprints were taken. He was in the system for some kind of run-in with the law up in Northern California. But it wasn't until 9 days later, and not until 10 p.m. on the evening of Wednesday, November 17, 1999, when Helen and Olga casually walked into an LAPD substation located on Wilshire Boulevard to report Paul missing. Olga was the one who did the talking, and she reported to the officer who took the report that the last time she and Helen saw Paul was at 6 p.m. on November 5th at his apartment when they were there to help him pay his rent. Olga described Paul's mental state as fair, possibly slipping. They said that they returned to his apartment 5 days later on November 10th, but were unable to locate him. Olga said that she came back after another 5 days on November 15th and asked the apartment manager to help her look for him inside his apartment. When they went inside, they found the TV had been left on. Olga was the one who signed the missing persons report and identified herself as Paul's cousin. So, dreamers, the only reason I think these two crazy old ladies got away with all this nonsense at the police station, filling out this report and all that stuff, is due to the fact that they were two crazy old ladies. Everything about this visit to the police station had red flags everywhere for me. but I know that's easy to say, knowing what we know in hindsight. First of all, you're talking about a 70-something-year-old man that is possibly slipping mentally. I would wonder why these women were not reporting him missing right away. Even the 12-year-old daughter of the apartment manager and the mom, who didn't even speak English, had enough sense to realize when they hadn't seen Paul for 3 days that something was very wrong. Those two genuinely worried about Paul. The 12-year-old helped this guy make his way to his front door. They cooked meals for him. They really had concern. I would also wonder why these two old ladies decided to come into the police station at 10 p.m. at night. Maybe they thought they had a better chance of being able to deal with some rookie who was given the worst shift, like the swing shift or the graveyard. And then Olga was identifying herself as Paul's cousin, and Helen was supposedly his fiancée. And while everybody's situation is different, I would have found it odd that one of these women would actually be engaged to Paul, allegedly, and that he has mental health problems and physical health problems, yet he's left to live all by himself. I don't know, maybe I'm being presumptuous, but if we're talking about two elderly people who are in their 70s who are engaged, it's going to be a lot different for them as opposed to when you're in your 20s and engaged. They've already lived a long life and had previous marriages. You're at this stage in your life when you really need a partner to depend on, and I would wonder why they weren't already living together. And I would also wonder why they only checked on him every 5 days or so and didn't become concerned when they hadn't seen him the first time around, and I would wonder why they waited so long to report him missing. Anyway, 2.5 weeks later, on December 3rd, Helen called the officer who was at the scene of Paul's death, Officer Willman, and identified herself as a friend of the family and Paul's one-time fiancé, and that she was also a friend of Olga's, who had filed the missing persons report. Officer Willman wouldn't give Helen a copy of Paul's accident report because she wasn't his next of kin. Eventually, Olga, identifying herself as Paul's cousin and only apparent close relative, did manage to get her hands on the report, which indicated Paul's death was an accident, which is exactly what they needed in order to start initiating their claims on his death benefits. 2 days after Paul's body was discovered in that alleyway, he was autopsied. At the time he died, he was 73 years old. He suffered multiple traumatic injuries, including 48 rib fractures. This trauma to Paul's chest area caused a fatal laceration to his aorta, and it was confirmed that his injuries were what it was thought to have been caused by at the initial scene of the accident. They were consistent with Paul having been run over by a car. Beginning in 1997, applications for at least 6 policies for life insurance or accidental death insurance had been made on behalf of Paul Vados, listing either Helen alone or both Helen and Olga as beneficiaries. In the applications and in the claims for the benefits, Helen was represented as Paul's fiancée and Olga as his cousin. An application was made on May 22, 1997 for a $50,000 whole life insurance policy through John Hancock Financial on Paul's life, with both Helen and Olga listed as beneficiaries. The policy was not issued because of Paul's poor medical history. Guarantee Trust Life Insurance Company, however, issued a policy for Paul with both Helen and Olga as beneficiaries, listing Olga's address as the place where Paul resided. Helen paid $16,724.34 in premiums and was eventually paid $30,318.08. Olga received $20,212.06. So here, for the first time, we get a real idea as to the financial hit that Helen took, not only in fronting all the money for the insurance premiums, but also having to split the payout with Olga. You can see that Olga, in the end, got the better deal. And when all is said and done, it wasn't really a very good return on a 2-year investment. I did the math. After deducting the cost of the premiums, Helen netted a grand total of $13,593.74, while Olga made away with a little over $20,000. In all, Olga made $6,618.32 more in the payout. But what hasn't been factored in was the cost of keeping Paul housed, fed, and clothed for those 2 years either. So it's probably fair to say that with this single policy, the ladies stood to gain nothing. They possibly even lost money. Of course, this is hardly the only policy that Helen and Olga purchased. Mutual of Omaha issued a $25,000 accidental life insurance policy for Paul with Helen as the sole beneficiary. She was listed on the policy as his fiancée. Paul's address on the policy was Helen's place of residence in Santa Monica. The initial premium payment was paid by check on Paul's personal checking account, but the address on the check again was Helen's. Helen made the claim for benefits following Paul's death, which was found to have been an accident. In the claim, Helen stated under penalty of perjury that Paul was her fiancé and that he was killed and struck by a vehicle while walking along North La Brea Avenue. Helen sent various documents in support of her benefit claim. So, as we can see here, this was Helen's manner of purchasing more policies on Paul's life without Olga's knowledge, using her address on everything to ensure that Olga would be kept in the dark about it. On March 20th, 2000, a little more than 4 months after Paul's murder, someone who was representing as Olga Rutterschmidt spoke to a representative at one of the insurance companies where both Helen and Olga held a policy on Paul's life. It was presumed to be Olga, and she stated that she was Paul's cousin and that the other beneficiary, Helen Golay, owed Paul $5,000, and Olga wanted to be paid by the insurance company before Helen did. Olga called back a few minutes later and asked that Helen not be informed of her request to be paid ahead of her. The company at first refused to pay either one of them on the claim because of suspected fraud based on the accident being a hit and run without any witnesses having seen the accident. Then Helen sent another letter to Mutual of Omaha on August 16, 2000, 9 months after Paul's murder, to complain about the delay in payment, and she issued a threat to sue them if they didn't show her the money. The company paid out the $25,000 to Helen on October 4, 2000, as she was the only beneficiary on this particular policy. On October 15, 1997, Monumental Life Insurance Company issued a $250,000 group accidental death insurance policy for Paul, with both Helen and Olga listed as beneficiaries. This was an insurance policy that was offered to customers who were Wells Fargo bank account holders. Paul had a Wells Fargo account in his name, but it was in the care of Olga Rutterschmidt, and her address was listed on the account. It was Helen, however, who paid the monthly premiums. Both Helen and Olga filed claims for the death benefits, but the matter was handled through an interpleader action, meaning the holder of the property, in this case the insurance company that issued the policy, initiated a lawsuit between Helen and Olga because they were both claimants to the policy. Helen and Olga ended up receiving $187,500, with the remainder of the balance, $62,500, going to Paul's estate and to the attorneys who handled the interpleader action. Continental Casualty Insurance Company issued a $250,000 accidental death insurance policy on Paul's life, again with Helen listed as his fiancée and Olga as his cousin. Helen had paid the premiums, and following Paul's death, she submitted the claim for benefits. Helen and Olga were ultimately paid out $65,785 each on this policy. American Bankers Insurance issued another $250,000 life insurance policy on Paul. On this policy, Helen's address was listed as his place of residence, and both she and Olga were listed as beneficiaries. Helen also paid the premiums on this policy from a bank account that was in Paul's name, but under Helen's address and phone number. The policy ended up paying both Helen and Olga a total of $63,964.41 in death benefits. On March 27, 1997, Interstate Assurance Company issued a $50,000 whole life insurance policy on Paul's life, with his place of residence listed as Helen's address. Helen was listed on this policy as Paul's fiance/caretaker, and it had a $50,000 accidental death rider in favor of Helen, with Olga listed as the contingent beneficiary, meaning, from what I understand, as long as Helen is alive to collect on this policy as the primary beneficiary, then Olga effectively stands to receive nothing. But that apparently wasn't good enough for Helen, because on May 3rd, 1997, a little more than a month after the policy was issued, it was modified to change the contingent beneficiary to Helen's daughter, Keisha. Ultimately, Helen was paid out $50,416.79 in death benefits under this policy. Guarantee Reserve Life Insurance Company issued an $11,000 whole life insurance policy and a $5,000 accidental death policy on Paul's life, with Helen listed as the sole beneficiary on the policy. In total, she paid $996.84 in premiums and was eventually paid out $16,000 in death benefits. So, as you can see, both Helen and Olga worked at undercutting each other behind each other's backs, even though Olga would later go on and blame Helen for being extra greedy and for getting them caught. The both of them were just as greedy as the other. It's just Helen had the money to put up front for the premiums and in the cost of taking care of their future murder victims. Helen also made more money. She owned properties. She was a professional lawsuit filer, and she ended up getting a bigger cut of several of the policies and purchased several policies without Olga's knowledge on Paul's life. So, Olga was a customer at a store called the Hollywood Rubber Stamp Company and had been since the late 1990s. She referred to herself as Olga Smith on her invoices and usually ordered signature rubber stamps. But she didn't bring in sample signatures with her to have stamps made from those. She would bring in copies of documents that had the signature that she wanted made, and was mostly worried about the stamps looking as authentic as possible, like an original signature and not a stamp. Sometime in 1997, Olga, going by Olga Smith, ordered and paid for a signature stamp that bore the name Paul Vados. During the investigation, a questioned documents examiner made the determination that Paul's signature on all the insurance policies and applications had been made by rubber stamp. A further handwriting analysis of the other information made on the insurance applications and documents were a match to Helen's known handwriting samples. Also among Helen's belongings was a post-it note that was found that had all of Paul's identifying information written down on it, and that writing was also consistent with the writing found on all of Paul's insurance policy documents. The next person Helen and Olga targeted was 50-year-old Kenneth McDavid. I already told you a good deal about him already. He attended Sacramento High School and Sacramento State University, and the last time any of his siblings actually saw him was sometime in 1994. And the last time any of them actually heard from him was in April or May of 2005, which was by phone, and it was only a message that he had left for one of them. Other than that, nobody really knew where Kenneth was living or what was going on with him. Then it was in late November of 2005 when Kenneth's sister was informed by police that he had died 5 months earlier on June 22, 2005. When asked about Helen and Olga, Kenneth's sister stated that she had never heard of either woman, she never met either one of them, and neither of them were related to Kenneth. Sometime in 2002, a couple who had recently arrived in Hollywood from Michigan, Patrick LeMay and his girlfriend, Amy Matte. It's either Matt or Matte, if you're fancy, Matte. So they had no place to stay when they arrived. They'd been pretty much urban camping, as they called it, outside the Hollywood Presbyterian Church, which is where they were given food. They became acquainted with Kenneth because he began urban camping outside the church as well around the same time. Eventually, the couple returned to Michigan. Sometime after that was when either Helen or Olga, or the both of them, met and became acquainted with Kenneth, and before long, they made him the offer that he could not refuse. they would help him rent an apartment and help feed and clothe him. This time, Helen rented an apartment in Hollywood, signing a lease on September 1st, 2002. Helen paid the rent by check from her own bank account, and she sent it to the leasing office each month, but she did not live at that apartment. Kenneth lived there alone. So that couple from Michigan, Patrick and Amy, they came back to Hollywood in the spring of 2002, and they ran into Kenneth at a Starbucks near the church. He told them that he had a place nearby, and he took them to see it. The couple subsequently went back to Michigan again, and then came back to California in 2004, where they met with Kenneth again at that same Starbucks. Kenneth offered to let Patrick stay at his apartment in exchange for him buying food and paying for the phone and cable TV bills. Patrick agreed and ended up staying at the apartment for approximately 3 to 4 months. Also during that time, his girlfriend Amy, along with another man named Daniel McKelvey and another woman whose name is unknown, also moved into the apartment, making the total number of occupants 5, including Kenneth. At some point, Patrick saw Olga at the apartment having a conversation with Kenneth. When she asked if Patrick was living there, Kenneth denied it. Olga then stated, "You know our arrangement, and that's why you can't have anybody living here." Kenneth later explained to Patrick that Olga paid the rent for him on the condition that he not allow anyone else live there with him. He also told Patrick that Helen and Olga both asked him to sign a life insurance policy as an act of good faith, which he did. Patrick asked if Helen and Olga were his relatives or if he was in a relationship with one or both women. Kenneth told him it was neither. The next time Patrick saw Olga, she was outside the apartment door throwing a hissy fit because there were 5 people living inside the apartment, despite her explicit instructions that nobody else be allowed to live there. Olga had used her own copy of the key to Kenneth's apartment to let herself in, while Kenneth tried to stop her from entering. So there was a tenant that lived at the same apartment complex where Olga resided, named Douglas Crapeau, and he had a number of conversations with Olga. And in these conversations, Olga mentioned that she worked for Helen Golay, who was in the real estate business, and that Helen had ordered her to evict someone, and she asked Douglas Crapeau to help her. She told Douglas to bring a gun with him because she needed protection from a very violent street person. Douglas drove Olga to the apartment where Kenneth was living. Together, they went into the unit. Douglas had his gun in his pocket. Once inside, they found Kenneth alone. As soon as they entered the apartment, Olga tugged at Douglas's arm and ordered him to show Kenneth the gun. But Douglas didn't do what he was told. Instead, Olga pulled the gun out of his pocket, and at that point, Douglas refused to help Olga anymore with this so-called eviction. It was clear to Douglas that Kenneth posed absolutely no threat to Olga. This entire encounter with Kenneth lasted only about 2 minutes. Some weeks later, Patrick went to the apartment but was unable to enter. Olga was inside with Kenneth along with an armed security guard, but eventually this guard allowed Patrick to retrieve his belongings. After putting his belongings in the car, Patrick surreptitiously followed Olga down the street as she walked to her vehicle, which was a Honda Civic, and that was parked over on the next block. Patrick tried to visit Kenneth a week or so later. Kenneth had come to the door and opened it, but the armed guard denied him entry. So, did Olga, this crazy old lady, actually hire an armed security guard to keep watch over Kenneth McDavid to prevent any randos from living at this apartment? Yeah, she actually did that. The security guard's name was Jose Luna. As per his job protocol, he was to wear a black uniform and was armed with a .40 caliber handgun that he kept holstered on his hip. He was hired by Olga on October 30th, 2004, and the instructions for the job were to secure Kenneth's apartment in order to prevent anyone from entering it. On that evening of the 30th, Olga let Jose into the apartment, and when he did, he saw an older man, which was Kenneth, along with a middle-aged couple. Olga angrily ordered the couple to leave, so they gathered up a few of their belongings and left the apartment, leaving Olga, Kenneth, and Jose inside. From there, Olga ordered Jose to remain at the apartment for the next several days from 1 p.m. to 1 a.m. She informed him that Helen was involved in this assignment of guarding this apartment, and when Jose was paid, he was given a check that would be cashed from Helen's personal bank account. The on-site manager at the apartment that Kenneth lived at was a woman named Danielle Cosgrove, and towards the end of 2004, Olga called her and demanded that they have the homeless people living in Kenneth's unit removed. Danielle understood that Olga was referring to Patrick and Amy, the couple from Michigan, along with at least 2 others that Kenneth invited to stay with him. But the thing was, the apartment was being rented and paid for by Helen, so Danielle told Olga that she needed to speak to her first before she could do anything about the subtenants. When Olga was told this over the phone, she became very angry and belligerent and started screaming at Danielle. Subsequent to that, over the next several weeks, both Helen and Olga, together and separately, made repeated demands that Danielle removed everyone that was living in the apartment unit with Kenneth. Helen and Olga, all hours of the day and night, continually made these demands of Danielle, as well as incessant demands directly to the people living with Kenneth and to Kenneth himself. Sometime afterwards, Danielle Cosgrove went on vacation, and when she came back, she found that there was no one living in the apartment anymore. One of the ladies called her up and told her that Helen had given up her tenancy. When Danielle inspected the unit, it appeared to her that Kenneth had left in a hurry. There was a lot of trash and bottles of prescription medications left behind. Shortly thereafter, Danielle encountered Kenneth on the streets in Hollywood, and he appeared to be homeless, and all of his belongings were attached to his bike. So, taking care of Kenneth wasn't as smooth sailing as these crazy old ladies had hoped it would be, and not nearly as smooth as it went for them when it came to Paul. But the investment into Kenneth had been made, and they had a hell of a lot more policies and a hell of a lot more to gain riding on Kenneth's life. They had to keep this guy on a tight leash in order to prevent him from doing what he had been doing for the better part of his adult life, and that would be drifting. Through the investigation, it was revealed that records indicated Kenneth stayed at various Hollywood motels from January through June 12, 2005, and those motel rooms were paid for by Helen, including a motel on La Brea from February 8th through March 30th, which was paid for in cash. Kenneth stayed at an Elcano Lodge motel from March 30th through June 12th, but also stayed at the Hollywood Studio Inn on Sunset Boulevard for 3 days during this period, from May 17th through May 20th. The last record of Kenneth staying at any motel was on June 12th, 2005. And, as I mentioned previously in part 1, Kenneth would be found dead in that alleyway just 10 days later, on June 22nd, 2005. Okay, so like I said at the opening of this episode, this was going to be 2 parts, but I'm getting to the point where the second part is turning out to be much longer than the first. And I don't know, lately, if I do multiple parts, I like the episodes to be roughly the same length. I don't like it when one part is an hour long and then the second part is 2 hours long. It's just kind of turned into a pet peeve over the years. The thing about this case that I was planning to skim over was all of the insurance policies, because I thought that it might sound a little redundant. But as I went along, each case was unique in its own way, and it really puts together an interesting picture of just how incredibly greedy, petty, and entitled these ladies were. So I kept the information about the policies in the episode, and thus it pushed the series into 3 parts. So when we come back, We're going to pick up the story from the acquisition of the murder weapon used in the death of Mr. Kenneth McDavid, and where the investigation made the leap from mail fraud to murder. I want to thank you all again for listening. I'm sorry if I sound really nasally and crappy today. I'm just under the weather. The final part of this will be available soon, so you won't have to wait much longer to binge. And as always, until next time, sweet dreams.